I'm Phil Ford. I'm a professor in the musicology department here at the Jacobs School of Music, and I have been here since 2007. I came here from University of Texas, where I was teaching before, and at that point in my life, I was a scholar of American post-war cultural and intellectual history. I ended up writing a book on the subject, Dig, Sound and Music and Hip Culture, which is about hipness and counterculture from the 40s through the 60s. And then after that book was published in 2013, I started getting more interested in philosophical topics, I guess you could say broadly philosophical, which includes religious, spiritual thought, esoteric thought, ideas around magic and the occult. And it goes without saying that those ideas have always found a somewhat insecure home in the mainstream institutions of intellectual life. And around 2015, I was very fortunate to meet somebody who became a very close friend, J.F. Martel, a Canadian philosopher who at that point was working in the Canadian film and TV industry. And both of us kind of had reached a point in our life where we felt the need to have conversations about these things that it turned out we were very much on the same page, had very similar interests. But both of us kind of felt like we hadn't found somebody to have those conversations with, and both of us love to talk. And so when we met, through the intercession of a friend of mine, Graham Larkin, who arranged a book launch event for JF's book, Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice, a book that I had discovered on my own and that had just blown me away. I was like, oh my God, here is a kindred spirit. After my friend Graham got us together, we started talking away 10 to the dozen, and we very quickly realized, okay, here is the conversation that we always wanted to have. And we started off sending emails, long letters back and forth to one another on philosophical topics, metaphysical topics, artistic topics, both of us being very committed art guys. And I forget exactly how this written conversation turned into a recorded, spoken conversation, but at some point in 2017, one of us had the idea to start a podcast. And I guess I would say that the motivation there, what I've often said, quoting the rocker Andrew W.K., if you can't find the party, be the party. And I would say that JF and I both had felt we couldn't find the party before. And so we started Weird Studies, this arts and philosophy podcast, which is mostly the two of us talking. Occasionally we have guests, but it's mostly the two of us. We founded that in order to throw ourselves a party, to find the space where a certain kind of intellectual conversation could happen that we weren't able to find elsewhere. And here we are almost 8 years later, and the podcast has grown substantially. Online community around it has grown substantially. I suppose I must have. The funny thing is that on any given day, I always sort of feel like me. And when I look back, I can realize that I've been on this very long journey, and I've been taking it step by step. And at each step, I feel like just the same guy. But then when I turn around and look back at all the distance I've traveled, I realize that I am actually quite different. I have been transformed by my journey. I suppose spending so much time talking into a microphone, but also thinking about an audience that is for the most part invisible, in which respect it's quite different from classroom teaching, where your students are right there and you engage with them and you can kind of feel the vibe of the room and adjust accordingly and so on. It's a live experience. Whereas doing a podcast is communication, but at one remove. And necessarily the style of your communication will change. You are imagining the people out there who are listening to you have some ideas who they are and what they're getting from your conversations. We get letters, and there are people in social media and various online sites that have been set up kind of around our show. And we get a pretty good idea of the audience, but again, somewhat at a remove. And I think that experience of talking into the air, imagining how your words are landing with people, and I guess I would say something about the way that conversation exists, half in real flesh and blood life and half kind of in the imagination. That's a very interesting phenomenon. And I think that must have left some traces in the way that I do my teaching in a classroom. I feel that the two things inform one another, however different they may be, and they're somewhat different. Being a professor, I think, has set me up for a certain way that I can present myself on the mic. Any teacher will tell you that when you teach, you develop a kind of teaching persona, which is not false exactly. It's not who I am, but also like I'm doing it right now in answering these questions and having this conversation with you. And the way I'm talking, although it's entirely typical of me in a certain sense, it's not, for example, how I'm going to talk to my wife when she comes home from work tonight. And so I feel, when you're a teacher, you were in the business of having a persona, shaping the persona for a particular end, for a particular purpose, which is, of course, to teach. And I feel that experience set me up for the analogous, not exactly identical, but similar process of, creating an identity, creating a persona in public. But then at the same time, it's a little bit different. And likewise, having a kind of persona on the mic probably influences by teaching, although perhaps you'd have to ask my students exactly how. Well, I suppose I can use the usual academic dodge in answering that, say, well, it depends on what you mean by the weird. But at least the way I tend to think of that word is to think about it as a relationship between yourself and the various things that propose themselves to your attention in life, the various things you encounter, situations, scenarios, people, phenomena. And the weird, in my thinking, is whatever is on the far side of a line between those things that come at you in this life that you can kind of easily accept as belonging to your life in this world, and the things that you can't, or at least that you find difficult to accept. So, for instance, something that I think happens a lot with people is seeing something bizarre, like a ghost or a UFO. I've never seen a UFO. A lot of my friends have, but I haven't. My partner, JF Martel, has a really interesting story about being on a school trip when he was in middle school. And him and all of his friends looking out the window and seeing this pulsating, rotating orange disc in the sky, in the night sky. And they're in the middle of nowhere in Quebec, heading home after some kind of field trip. And all of the kids are freaking out about this, looking through the window. And the school teacher who had come with them as the like chaperone or the whatever, the person leading the group. This is the part of the story that really sticks out in my mind, that the kids, while pointing at this thing in the sky, and they were like, sir, look. And JF tells me that their teacher just sort of looked at him with a kind of empty sort of smile, like a lights on nobody's home kind of smile, and he wouldn't turn around. just wouldn't turn around, didn't say anything, didn't offer like a justification. Oh, I'm not going to turn around because blah. Just wouldn't do it. And it was like almost as weird as the UFO off there in the sky. And I see this kind of thing not infrequently, which is like people encounter weird stuff. And it has a habit of sneaking up on you when you don't expect it. There's something that you're not prepared to acknowledge exists in this world. If you don't think that UFOs are a thing, then if you see one, well, now what? And I think what a lot of people do is they try to make the world normal again. They try to square everything away. I probably didn't see anything. Or, they come up with something where they rationalize away their experience and try as hard as possible to forget about it, sort of in this kind of mechanism of denial that JF's teacher seemed to demonstrate in that anecdote that I just shared. And I suppose I would say that the very great thing about encountering the weird is to be willing to encounter the weird, or to be willing to encounter whatever it is that life is throwing at you that you have some difficulty coming to grips with. And I mean, I'm talking about UFOs and ghosts and stuff like that, but it doesn't have to be weird in that sense. There's nothing weirder than any of us is ever going to experience than, friendships and relationships. Those throw all kinds of stuff at us that we have no preparation for. And it seems to me that a way of being in such situations, whether they're the big splashy, weird events like a UFO in the sky, or the much subtler events that might befall one in a loving relationship that takes place over many years. I think the thing that really matters is having a kind of an open-hearted, courageous, curious willingness to accept what's right in front of your nose. That to me is a kind of very great and valuable thing. And I think that opens you up to a more expansive understanding of life, of what matters in your life and in our lives generally. I sometimes complain about a certain attitude that some people have about higher education, which is that this is a consumer business and the students are the consumer and we're offering them a product, namely a degree or an education. And the reason I don't like that is because when you're a consumer, the whole idea is that you want to be a smart shopper. You know in advance what your needs are, and you know what would satisfy those needs. And on the basis of that knowledge, you make a consumer decision. However, with education, you can't know what you'll need. There's no informed consent to human growth. You don't know where you're going to be. In your freshman year, you probably have certain ideas about where you're going to be in your senior year, and you're going to imagine it as basically being the way you are now, but maybe with different hair, right? But actually, when you're a teacher, you see this, or when you're a parent, you see this. People grow hand over fist and in the most unpredictable directions. And one problem that I think sometimes comes up in an elite high-end school of music is the idea, and it goes with what I was saying before about like feeling like you can't put a foot wrong. A kind of closed mindset where you're like, I already know what I need to be doing here. I know what kinds of activities and what kinds of knowledge and practice and so on would go into that. And because I can't afford to put a foot wrong, I'm going to just work on those things. And I'm going to treat anything that doesn't fit my preconceived notion of what I need to be doing. I'm going to treat that as a distraction, as a waste of my time. And I'm as much as possible going to avoid that. And that can be a recipe for stagnation. And maybe you are killing it in the practice room. You're in there for 8 or 10 hours a day, and your technique is shrink wrapped, and you're the envy of all the other people in your studio. But that can be a little bit of a trap, right? Because you might, all this time, with your diligent effort, you might be closing yourself off to other things that could really open you up artistically, give you a broader view. Repertories, for example, that they're not for your instrument. Like if you were a pianist, for instance, I was a piano student back in the day, and I remember reading, the great pianists like Vladimir Horowitz talking about how, I don't listen to piano music, I listen to opera, because if you listen to opera, that's how you become great. That's how you learn to float a really beautiful melodic line, learn from singers. And I remember being, a lowbrow pianist and just being like, well, I don't like opera. And eventually I got there, right? But like that would be an example of how, like, you may think, oh, well, I don't know, I'm not interested in opera. I mean, that's not my repertory. That's singer's stuff. But that's like a simple example of how something from a little bit outside of your orbit might really make a difference for you, might give you new ideas, new artistic motivation, new insights. And if that's true for different repertories of music, I think it's also true for different ideas. I like to talk a lot about philosophy in my classes, and for some people that's off-putting because they just hear the word philosophy and they think like stuff that I don't understand and don't care about, and it has nothing to do with my life. And I always say to people, you have a philosophy. Whether you know what it is or not, you have one. And I feel like my job as a teacher, in part, is to be kind of a midwife, assisting the birth of ideas that you already have. You know what they are yet, but I feel like it's my job to lead you to a better understanding of them. And from that point of view, once you start making what is implicit explicit, you start understanding, like, what is this I really think about X, Y, and Z? Then new ideas can come in and they can make a difference. They can change things for you. And again, you don't know what you'll need. But education is a process of finding out. What I would like students to know is that it's possible. I think there's something that you hear a lot when you're in the arts, in the United States, but perhaps in other countries as well. And it's like, what you do as an artist doesn't really matter. Nobody cares. What, you do classical music? No one listens to classical music, right? You play jazz? No one listens to jazz. There's this irritable habit that some people seem to have. They just want to stick a pin in the balloon of young artists' self-regard. I don't know what it is. People feel that you have to take artists down a peg by reminding them how little anybody cares about this. But let me tell you something. In the years that I've been doing weird studies, I have learned that that is all a damn lie. People care about art. People care about thinking. people want this. Not all people, but a lot of people, and not just people who are working in a university or, attending a university. We get letters all the time from people of all walks of life, people who have, cubicle jobs that put bread on the table, but that are, not engaging the person's passion, but they're doing it for their family. Or somebody who's like, one guy who hit us up on Christmas Eve, he's a roofer who's like supporting his young family, and he's up there freezing his ass off on a roof on Christmas Eve, doing it for his family. And, we hear from folks who are in, as I say, all walks of life. And what they have in common is that they are hungry for something more. There's got to be something more than this. And by this, it might be, whatever, profession, or just the daily ankle-biting irritations of life, or just even if it's a pretty good life, even if it's a great life, like even if your life is jammed to the rafters with good things and fun and exciting opportunities and luxury vacations and so on, like, I think if a lot of people are still going to be like, yeah, but what's it all for? Or what's it all about? Maybe, like a lot of people maybe don't ask that question, but a lot of people do. And not just like people who are like working in a university, professors or whatever. Lots of people ask those questions because that is a very human question. And you kind of can't get rid of that. You can't remove that from human beings, from the range of human life. And so, when we started doing weird studies, we didn't even really have a plan of like how long we were going to do it or what we thought would happen as a result of doing it. We just started doing it because, we wanted to throw a party. We wanted to, we couldn't find the party, so we had to be the party. And people started showing up and showing up and showing up. And, the community grew and grew and grew. And then at a certain point, it's sort of like, okay, well, why don't we organize this? We have this website now called weirdesphere.org, which is a teaching and learning platform where, I'll co-teach a class in the summer when I'm not teaching here at IU. JF and I will do a summer class. We have other people who come in and teach for us, teach on our platform, like Eric Davis or Matt Carden. And in this way, sort of like building this like community of people who, as I say, come from all walks of life, all different ages, from high school students to pensioners and everything in between, people with PhDs, people with a high school education and everything in between. And what they all have in common is just like they want to be there because they care about art, because they want to have their minds open. They want to think about stuff. I have a former doctoral advisee, Kate Altizer, wonderful scholar herself, a wonderful person. And she said, the best thing I ever heard about teaching. And she said, like, I think that my job as a teacher is to encourage people to take pleasure in their own thoughts. And a lot of people feel like, that's not for them, right? That's for some guy with a PhD, some guy who teaches at Princeton or something. Like, that's the kind of guy who gets to take pleasure in his own thoughts. I'm like, no. I think you can hit people with the idea that this is, in fact, their birthright as human beings. You get to take pleasure in your thoughts. And all of this is to say that disempowering narrative that musicians and other artists hear all the time, that no one cares, that this is this very niche thing. Oh, how nice it must be for you to have the privilege to study bass trombone or whatever. But, that's not the real world. I suppose what I would like to say to anybody who might be watching this video is to turn a deaf ear to that. What you're doing as a student, as an artist, as a thinker, whether you think of yourself as such or not, to me, that's the most inspiring thing. That's the best part of what it is to be a human. You get to participate in that. And trust me, there are others who are dying to participate in that with you. Believe that. Bet on yourself. Go out in the world and throw a party. Well, it's funny because when I published Dig 12 years ago, I was like, all right, it's done. This millstone around my neck, I finally got to put it down. I finished it. I have an object, a book. It's complete. And now, 12 years later, it's more obvious to me when I look at that book that what it is not a complete object, but again, really more of a verb than a noun. It's a process, and the book as published is a snapshot of that process, or a cross-section of something that was ongoing. And now, my scholarly work or my intellectual commitments have changed rather from back then. I'm still interested in post-war American cultural and intellectual history. But I feel like the process of which Dig was a snapshot, a moment in time, that process is now being carried forth by other people. And that's how scholarship works. Every idea, every book, every article, every communication, every publication whatsoever is an entry in an ongoing conversation, a conversation that never ends. And so that was my intervention in that particular conversation. What is there to learn from it? Well, I won't tell you what there is to learn from my book, because I would be the last to know, wouldn't I? Because I wrote the damn thing, so I'm like, even after 12 years, still kind of a little too close to it to be able to say anything very determinate about what one might learn from it. But I will say that the overall process of doing that work, my approach was highly interdisciplinary. I've always said that my method, such as it is a kind of pattern recognition. Being able to see pattern shapes of like the shape of a thought as it emerges across multiple media, in news articles or interviews or film performances or, a quiz show or a novelty Christmas album or whatever. If you have an open mind about what might possibly go into your topic, if you kind of hang loose with your data, as my old friend Jim Buehler liked to say, you have a broader array of data points, of things that you can start connecting and finding patterns within. And I think that approach, I would say kind things about that approach because it's my approach. So naturally, I think it's the best possible approach, right? But I think maybe it might be helpful for other people as well to perhaps try to do something along those lines in their own style, in their own along their own interests, trying to hang loose with the whole motley array of culture, of all the things that a culture can show you. Don't say too much at the front end what will and will not be relevant for your subject, because you have no idea. And be willing to explore, be willing to draw connections. I would hope that that would be something maybe somebody could pick up from my earlier work on cultural history. Well, I can tell you the big thing that I'm doing for that fellowship is a week-long sort of multi-day event called Weird Academia, which is going to consist of several events, one of which is a live show of weird studies at the IU Cinema following a screening of Ken Russell's uber bizarre film, Altered States. If ever there was a Weird Academia film, it would probably be that one. We're doing a live show on the stage of the Buskirk Chumley with some people that we're bringing out here. Jeff Kripal, well-known scholar of comparative religion. Eric Davis, a public intellectual who is the OG of what I call the intellectual sphere of the weird. The artist, photographer Shannon Taggart, primatologist Kat Hobater, and I'm sure I'm forgetting, and JF, of course, and me. We're going to have this conversation on stage of the Buskirk Chumley. Oh, and Jacob Foster, who I'm collaborating with in this whole thing. He's the director of the Center for Possible Minds. So we're doing a bunch of events, and that's super exciting, and it's set up so that I get to do the thing that I most like to do, which is to talk, to have conversations. I love conversations. I love conversations because conversations are a microcosm of the whole process of intellectual discovery. You start off in a ramble, you don't know where you're going to end up, and you end up in some place that you could never have imagined. But I am wandering somewhat from the point. What is to be learned from something like that? Well, I've been fortunate to get support from the university, that people have taken an interest in what I'm doing. But I think, a student who is trying something kind of speculative, untried, running it up the flagpole to see if anyone salutes it. You don't have to be some kind of well-established professorial type. And you don't have to necessarily be pulling down some kind of big grant, although those grants exist. And I would strongly encourage anybody watching this video to take an interest in the organizations, the entities that want to help you realize your creative vision, whatever that might be. But I suppose I would say kind of a version of the thing I've been saying all along in this conversation. Be your own party, figure out the stuff that you care about, that really matters to you, that you don't see being talked about or expressed or performed. And rather than waiting around for somebody to do it for you, think what can I do? What party could I throw? There's a very great kind of creativity that goes with just organizing stuff like that. It's very much its own kind of art. And it's always a good time to start practicing that art. It's never too early. It's interesting that you used the word artifact, because I think that points to something in the nature of the transformation that you're talking about, which I think is away from objects and towards processes, from nouns to verbs. And this, I think, has been going on for some time. And I think it's also something that happens at multiple levels and scales in our culture. It's not just something that pertains to musicians. I mean, on the most sort of grandiose level, you can think about how the very idea of ownership of physical objects, of media, books, and recordings, for example, has gone from an ownership model to a rental model. You don't own the books on your Kindle. You have a license that permits you to use them. You're borrowing for all intents and purposes. And the same thing, it's just sort of with Spotify. You don't own what's on Spotify. You pay a license in order to access it. And there are good and bad things about that. And I don't really want to get into the, whys and wherefores of it, but I will just say that, the condition of life in 21st century America, and perhaps everywhere else as well, is of what one cultural theorist calls liquid modernity. As Karl Marx said, 170 years ago, all that is solid melts in air. There's a feeling that the kind of like the system that we live within, the sort of a hyper-accelerated capitalism, is one in which fixity, durability, durable monuments to really almost any kind of activity, those seem to be, they're not gone, but they're transformed. I mean, I'm speaking rather abstractly. I can say in my own work, like I continue to write things that are published in journals, that are bound between hardcovers in the library of this and many other universities. And those would be objects, right? Monuments to my brilliance as a scholar. But the real heart of the work that I'm doing these days is this series of conversations on weird studies with my friend JF. And those aren't going to be bound between hardcovers in the university library. I've been doing public scholarship in what I guess we could call content media for a long time. I had what might have been the first musicology blog, or certainly the first musicology group blog, all the way back in 2006. So I've been doing this for a while. And one thing that at a certain point kind of started creeping up on me and my awareness was the realization that however many hundreds of thousands of words I've written for, a public audience, or however many millions of words have spilled out of my mouth in the years that we've been doing weird studies, those words are in a certain sense written on the wind. Like, where is a podcast going to be preserved after its hosts are gone? We don't know, because podcasting is such a new media. But it's probably a pretty good guess that the preservation, if it exists at all, is going to be of a sort that work is kind of passed through. It doesn't persist as objects, as monuments. It's more like a life spent teaching. A life spent teaching. What do I have to show for it? Well, I have to show for it all of those moments that I've shared with people. Moments of insight or hilarity or unease or whatever. That's not nothing. I mean, if you ask me, that's a life well lived. But that life doesn't fit between hardcovers in the library either. And so I think what I am dealing with as a scholar is thinking about what is the nature of a creative life and what do you have to show for it? I once wrote, some of what I'm saying now, I wrote in an essay for the Journal of Musicological Research called What Was Blogging? I was writing about the old blogosphere from before Facebook and Twitter killed it. And at the end, I say, something like, you want to have something to show for your life, but in a world of liquid modernity, that's a vain hope, right? That's a mug's game. You might not have something to show for your life, but what I'm interested in is having something to show that I'm living.